welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and Tony has the bad idea for us this week. However, I want to jump in real early and mention that I, knowing what this bad idea is, am 100% on board with it. It is not a bad idea for me. Tony, what is the idea that you're going to be telling us about this week?
We're going to be talking about the XFL, the Extreme Football League set up by Vince McMahon.
Extreme!
And you wouldn't be the only one that was actually really into this whenever it was just conceptualized. Like, there were a lot of people into this, but at the turn of the century, the NFL had become a namby-pamby sport. With novel ideas like protecting players, it had become a shell of its former self. It was no longer a place for men like Dick Butkus to destroy his fellow man.
That's not
It was a
real
softer,
name.
gentler organization based
That's
around
not a real
ratings and
person's
merchandise. What's that?
Dick Butkus?
You never heard of Dick Butkus?
Would I be reacting this way if I'd heard of Dick Butkus before?
I mean, there's a reason why he became such a mean man.
Yes. Him and the boy named Sue.
Yes.
I apologize. That's in Tony's notes, but I just had to derail for a second there. Please continue talking about the XFL.
Of course, all this was according to World Wrestling Federation founder Vince McMahon, who believed that the sport had gone soft.
Okay. So those were not your ideas that we should just let people have concussions and stuff.
Well, it's something that's actually kind of pervading still. There's a lot of people saying that the sport has gone soft and that it's not about smash mouth football anymore, that there's too many penalties. There's a lot of people who still believe that, and they think the spirit of the game has kind of gone as culture has kind of softened, and as we've learned more about like CTE and various other issues that happen with a lot of these people.
So Vince McMahon sees a problem with football, knows how he's going to fix it. How's he going to fix it, Tony?
Well, he's going to take the experience that he had with the WWE and build up a brand of football that's going to take on the NFL directly. A lot of people don't know that when Vince McMahon started the WWE, like, wrestling was this fractured thing with tons of small organizations, no united belts, and he basically built it up from the ground. He took it from his father and bought all these other organizations and turned names like Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan and all these others into a household name. During this, he became friends with NBC executive Dick Ebersol. Together, they combined to make things like the WWE Raw show, which is still going on today and is one of the longest-running series of all time. Dick Ebersol is also the one who created Saturday Night Live. So, putting their skills together, they were able to get a deal working with NBC to make sure that the XFL would have a home. And this is actually really good timing from Vince McMahon because the NFL was having contract disputes over which network would get to have their product. They wanted $500 million to license it per year, and NBC was looking at a $100 million loss just to be able to air the NFL. Rather than fork over the cash, Fox and CBS paid for it, and NBC, for the first time in many, many years, lost the NFL. So they had this big gaping hole in their sports coverage that used to have the NBA, MLB, NFL, Olympics, just everything was on NBC Sports. And with this gap, Vince McMahon came up with the idea of the XFL. He announced it in 1999 and really got working on it in 2000 and built a football league in 1 year.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess he's not starting from zero because he's already got the clout of being Vince McMahon, of having all of these really successful credits to his name. But even so, logistically speaking, getting all that running is really impressive.
Yeah, and that would end up being one of the biggest problems with the XFL, but we'll get to that. His main idea was to bring grit back to football. Everything from the scramble, which is how they started games, instead of doing a coin toss, they would do what was called the scramble, have two of the fastest players run 30 yards, and whoever ended up with the ball, that team got it first. So they wanted it to be very competitive. the very first thing that happened during one of these games was Dick Butkus went on the field and was like, "No way, Jose, we're gonna compete for the right to have the ball," and it turned into like you saw these little shadows of the WWE behind it. The very first thing of the broadcast was literally Vince McMahon walking out on the field and screaming out, "This is the XFL," in his like full on like WWE voice. He was supposed to be kind of the quiet executive in the back. And instead, he's out there at the very center of everything.
Leading the charge.
Yeah, he wanted to have football that had less penalties, that was rougher and didn't penalize players for big hits. He felt like that was what people wanted from football. They wanted to see smash mouth football with people grinding against each other and just have a very strong brand that wasn't slowed down by penalties every time somebody got touched.
To be fair, and his background is wrestling.
Yes.
Right? Like, I don't want to say real wrestling is not that impressive to watch compared to what Vince McMahon created in the WWE.
Yeah. Like, if you watch real wrestling and you have... Yeah, if you watch real wrestling and you really know what to look for, it can be impressive, but you're never seeing some guy fly off the turnbuckle to drop an elbow in, like, Olympic-style wrestling. So he definitely knew how to build that show. And people were really hyped for this. They built up 8 teams across the country, and for the very first broadcast, they hit 50 million people. It was like a 10-point something on the Nielsen ratings, which was higher than what the World Series drew, higher than so many other sporting events that in the past that they were able to actually get that up there.
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah, it's a huge number right off the bat. And people watching really liked a lot of these ideas. They had bigger than life characters in these players, and instead of having the names on the back of the jerseys, you could choose to have your name if you wanted to, but they wanted the players to let their personalities shine through. So they did more interviews with players, they did more locker room stuff, and they also let them put their own nickname on the back of the jersey. The most known player would be Rod Smart, who had "He Hate Me" on the back. And that was because he said that whenever they're playing against him, he hate me, everybody hates him because he's so good. And he just, like, hyped it up all the time. Like, mid-game, they would do interviews with him, like, on the sidelines, and it would go over the loudspeaker so even the audience could hear it. They also had names like Chronic, Y2K1, Mondo, Erupt, Baby Boy, Tater, and Teabagger.
Sounds like a colorful cast of characters.
Yeah, so you've got that going on NBC, which is just weird to me. Like, it's such a strange idea that they would have this going on. Also, like, the cheerleaders were getting, like, completely, like, every single episode of this, they wore a little bit less, wore a little bit less, wore a little bit less, and they were starting to look more like the divas from the WWE.
I'm just imagining this succeeding and, like, having some kind of storyline arc where the cheerleaders take over the football field or something.
I could see something like that, especially because they actively encouraged the players to date the cheerleaders. Like, they wanted those sorts of storylines to pop up.
So they're pushing for this kind of reality TV, larger-than-life story to be created.
And that was a big reason for some of the innovations that they came up with. The XFL was actually the first league to mic up players so that you could have people up in the booth hear what was said or hear the hits from the player's perspective. Like, the NFL does this a lot now. Like, in weekly, they'll release, like, a mic'd up thing on their YouTube channel where it's showing, like, Matt Stafford from the Lions in, like, a fourth quarter comeback and all the things he went through. Like, the high drama that happens whenever he literally separates his shoulder from his body but stays in the game so that he can go on and win. Like, things like that, like, were inspired because of the XFL. Same with the Skycam, which has brought some of the coolest angles in football. You're looking at a camera that's about maybe 15 feet above the action and behind it, but can track over the stadium on a wire system, so you get these incredible angles. You see holes open up, you see how a play develops in a way that you couldn't see on normal television.
I just realized we are living in an age when we could have football helmets with cameras in them.
Yeah, so there's been talk of that. There's also been a lot of talk of, like, refs wearing cameras since they're out of the action. They're not going to be breaking as many.
I mean, a GoPro, for what they're spending on NFL-type money, would not be that hard to replace.
That's true.
That would be incredible. If you got a first-person NFL thing, I've derailed it again, Tony.
No,
Dick Butkus with his GoPro camera has taken Albert's attention.
But yeah, they also they went a little bit further than the NFL will in that they had people, they had cameramen actually on the field, like just 5 feet behind the quarterback, like, and a lot of times they actually did get caught up in the action and get crushed, or like they got some really cool camera angles and everything. But there were also times where the camera guys were getting in the way.
So what went wrong, Tony? This sounds like unicorns and things fried in butter and bacon, all wrapped up into one. How is this bad? What's the bad idea here?
The bad idea was putting this together too quickly. The teams only had 1 month to practice, to recruit, to get everything together from absolute scratch. And you're talking about a lot of guys that had some college football experience, a fair amount of former NFL players. But it takes a long time to actually get a team together. Like, there are AA and AAA colleges, or Division II colleges, that spend 2 years practicing before they even field a team so that they can actually compete. It takes a long time to develop any sort of chemistry. And in this 50 million people watching game, the very first one of the season, they end up having one of the worst played football games ever. Where, like, you'll see the quarterback go to throw the ball and it just slips out of his hand and flies backwards. You'll see drops. You see just terrible, terrible football. Also, on one of the first scrambles that they did, the thing I was telling you about earlier, a player ended up tearing all the ligaments in his knees before a game even started. Like, it was just a little bit too rough for some of those types of things. In that first game, though, you saw the Las Vegas Outlaws and the New York Hitmen, and it was just absolutely sloppy football. You had people in Las Vegas that were wearing jerseys, painting their faces, excited to actually have a team, and by the end of the game, they were booing their own team.
Wow. That does sound like it might be a problem.
Yeah, and like everything else about this was rushed too. Like, whenever they made the announcement with NBC, they didn't have a single coach. They didn't have stadium rights. They didn't have an idea of even what the rules would be. They didn't publish a rule book and get it to the coaches until a couple weeks before their practices started. They didn't have a preseason to be able to hone their skills like the NFL does, and it just turned out to be this incredible mess of bad football. And the thing was, it wasn't all bad football, because there were teams that were above the others, like the LA Extreme, the ones that would go on to win the championship that year in the $1 million game, which is basically like the winning team gets $1 million to split between its players. These players were getting paid $4,000 a game to play, so much less than what the NFL is doing, but they also got a bonus of $4,000 if they won, so they actually had more incentive to play hard, which isn't the worst idea I've heard. But during the second broadcast, they ended up having a really good shootout competitive football game. And in the middle of the game, it went completely black. And nobody could figure out why. They were trying to figure out why power went out. And it wasn't even the stadium. It was just power in the van for the broadcast booth. And, like, crews were scrambling. They went to the alternate game, and it was just a terrible game against, I want to say, like, the Orlando Rage or something like that. But they stopped play, and they kept on, like, searching for this, and they found out that somebody didn't fill the generator. So somebody forgot to fill that with gas during one of their most exciting games that they've ever had, so they ended up having to cut out that game. And it was supposed to be this big doubleheader thing, because after that, they were going to have Jennifer Lopez, who was just red hot at the time, most popular, like, singer on SNL, and it was supposed to be this, like, lead-in to it. And instead, they're having people run around the parking lot siphoning gas from vehicles to fill up this generator so that they can get it back on. So you already have an hour delay, and this game ends up going into double overtime, so it ends up lasting an extra almost 2 hours over the broadcast, which pushes SNL way late at night for their main, like, the main thing that they were hoping to get out there for people, for SNL sagging ratings, and it just ended up completely ruining that night.
I'm starting to see why the bad idea here, Tony. It's an execution.
Yeah, it's completely an execution. And at this point, they started seeing sagging ratings. Every week, it just dropped and dropped and dropped to the point where, like, it went from 50 million to its first week to less than 5 million in its last week. And as these ratings started to sag, Vince McMahon started adding more elements from the WWE, trying to get these ratings up. Like, instead of just going into the player locker rooms, they started going into the cheerleader locker rooms and trying to just get more skin on TV. And that's all well and good for what you're trying to do, and I actually thought it was pretty funny when they did it. You could tell it was completely staged and everything. There's no nudity. But then all of a sudden you see, like, Rodney Dangerfield walk out of the showers with these, like, cheerleaders and just, like, fun stuff like that. But it felt very tacky at the same time. And, like, it got to the point where for the last few games of the season, they were just hiring strippers to sit in a hot tub in the end zone so that they could get, like, just a little bit more camera angle of that.
This is that sounds desperate, Tony.
Yeah. It's also interesting because doing the announcing for this whole season was sitting governor of Minnesota, Jesse the Body Ventura.
Well, he's got a connection there, right? He was out of
he was out of pro wrestling, and he was a former football player and everything. But it's still weird that the sitting governor of Minnesota would literally go down on the field at halftime and badger head coaches and try to threaten them because they didn't want to talk to him, yelling that, like, the coaches are scared of him. And, like, it just turned into this weird mess and debacle. As the season wore on, it just, like, people could not take it seriously. They started even introducing, like, elements of Kayfabe, which is, like, the unwritten rule in wrestling that you don't talk about things that are staged. Like, you don't break character, you don't do that. And they started having elements of that to build beef between players to try to make these rivalries seem more intense. But when you hadn't played these teams before, you can't really have much of a rivalry. You have to establish that over time.
I think maybe one of the problems here is that Vince McMahon came from wrestling, where you can manage individual people and their skills, and you can even, like, say how things are going to play out. So you can create a storyline where somebody's down and then they come back, or, you know, there's a shocking upset. But in football, it sounds like, anyway, that they faked all this stuff out, but they were still playing real football games and not very well.
And you're definitely right with that. It's harder to control 40 people, most of whom don't want to be on camera. There's definitely some people that were, like, hamming it up and wanted to be on the camera, but very few of the coaches wanted to build up the wrestling style pre-hype. They just wanted to focus on football. And managing 40 people on each side, that ends up being a lot of people that you're trying to get to buy into this. Also, there's a lot more drops in football. It's a lot less controllable. So even if they were trying to rig some games to be more exciting or anything like that, it gets very difficult to control that sort of outcome when there's so much chaos in football.
So what became of the XFL, Tony? Why are we still not watching the XFL, as if I needed to ask?
Basically, it came down to those sagging ratings, and whenever they had their Super Bowl, like their giant broadcast at the end of the season, the $1 Million Bowl, like, nobody cared. And Vince McMahon was really pushing. He wanted that second season because that's what they actually got with NBC. Like, NBC paid them $60 million to have a second season. And basically they just said, we can't air this. Like, you can't put this on TV right now. We're not going to make any money, and it's just demeaning to the sport. Like, you saw Bob Costas, who's one of the bigger announcers for the Olympics for various sports and everything, do an interview with Vince McMahon, and he baited Vince McMahon into looking like a crazy person, like Tom Cruise level jumping on the couch type crazy. And it just turned out like, and that's NBC's own Bob Costas making their other people look bad. Every step they took to try to make this work just did not work out for them.
I bet at least the Bob Costas thing got ratings.
Yeah, that probably got some good ratings. That was part of the 30 for 30 on ESPN. Like, if you want to see a really interesting documentary on this, like, there's a documentary called This Was the XFL, and it goes in depth on all of these problems and lets you see some highlights and how bad the football play was. But in the end, it really came down to Ebersol and McMahon just not putting enough time into this. And it's not like Ebersol would go on to have a bad career. He's actually been involved in 8 of the 10 largest live broadcasts in history, be it Super Bowls and Olympics and things like that. So he had a very successful career. He's retired now. But yeah, that pretty much does it for the XFL. I think that if they would have taken the time, we would have had a legitimate competitor for the NFL. Because if you go on forums nowadays, you see so many people who disagree with almost everything that Commissioner Goodell does. You see people that want that old action back. And even with like the CTE and everything, I'm sure that the XFL would have found ways to protect its players by following the NFL's example, which admittedly isn't enough so far. But there's so many people who are tired of the over merchandising, of the like extra commercials, of just everything being so played out. And I'm sure there's space for it. Like there was the USFL back in the day, which almost became a competitor. And like I think people are still kind of clamoring for it. Like even NFL Europe was starting to get a lot of attention before it was inexplicably like canned for almost no reason. Like they were at their highest ratings ever whenever they just decided to cancel that. And like I think that
sounds like a whole other interesting story, Tony.
Yeah, like I'm sure there's some interesting things that happened in the background of that. I haven't personally researched it, but I enjoyed watching that. It was basically like a real minor league for the NFL. Like you saw skilled players that were trying to build their way into the NFL, and like even just cool jerseys like the Munich Galaxy and all this. Like they were cool looking teams. So I think that there could be a place for this if somebody wanted to develop it. But now NBC is back to broadcasting the NFL. They do have the highest quality broadcast, in my opinion, like Sunday Night Football. With like they've got two really good announcers. They've got the best camera quality. It's a lot of fun to actually watch what they've gotten back into. But I still feel like there's a way to compete with the NFL other than like Canadian Football League, which is just weird.
I have no idea about that, Tony.
Well, it's a longer field, slightly wider. Like, it's a little bit odd. But
maybe we should go into Australian rules football. I've heard good things about them.
Yeah, get some rugby action.
Yeah, well, this is... I don't know if this belongs in the podcast, Tony, but I've been listening recently to people talking about the idea that when you pad people up, they end up hitting harder than they would if they weren't all super protected. So you end up with, like, fewer broken bones, but you also end up with like a lot worse concussions.
Yeah, it's straight up armor to hurt people, like is how a lot of players treat it. Like look up the hit from Danny Trevathan about a week ago. As of this recording, he took out somebody from the Green Bay Packers, and you saw the mouthpiece go 5 feet in the air. Like, it was one of the most brutal hits I've ever seen. It was completely unnecessary, and it was just helmet-to-helmet contact. Like, you saw this person go unconscious. And
when you're wearing a helmet, you can smash your face into somebody, which you probably wouldn't do if you didn't have that big grill right there.
Yeah, and if you did, it would be like... you would want the cost of that hit to be worth it. Like, to put yourself on the line like that. The armor is definitely there to protect you, and they've made better helmets, but it's so vicious that it really can only counter so much.
That's my third off topic for this week, but I think we'll do it for our episode on the XFL. Thanks, everybody, for listening. If you have a bad idea that you would like us to cover, you can send it to us at badideashow@gmail.com. And don't forget that you can support the show through Patreon.
Our patrons actually get a bunch of really cool stuff. It's not just early content releases. It's Christmas cards, it's postcards, it's pins, it's shirts, all sorts of awesome things come your way whenever you become a patron. You can start at just $2, and that accounts for a lot of YouTube views and a lot of other things. It's a great way to support this podcast, support the shows you love, and we will see you next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye.